So today I'm going to try to do two things. One area of research that the four lectures I'm giving here are grouped under the rubric of Enlightenment and peripheries. And partly that's because I'm writing a book about the Russian Enlightenment and have been thinking about recent models. And I'll come back to this question of center and periphery. We talked a little bit about it last week. Mandelstam is completely outside that framework, and I'm not going to dwell on him now. I'll talk about that the next time. But three of the lectures are dedicated to Enlightenment or Russia in the 18th century, and two of them are about Catherine the Great. I'm going to try to do two things today. One is to talk about, but both come out of, they're interrelated, and they both come out of two parallel projects. And one is a digital humanities project, and the other is perhaps, and the other is an analytical attempt to use the database we've created, is an attempt to answer some research questions. But they both come out of an interest in the correspondence of Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia. And I talked about that last week, and I'm not going to repeat too much of what I said last week. We spent a good hour talking about the type, describing Catherine's correspondence, the topics, the style, and her intellectual. So one of my projects over the past few years has been in collaboration with Kelsey Rubin-Detlev, who's now an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, has been the study of the correspondence of Catherine the Great. So here you have the cover of a book that's about to come out, and it's very traditional technology, the technology of the book, which we all know and love. And this is the first anthology of Catherine the Great's letters to appear, I think, in pretty much any language from across the correspondence. And this is the cover, and it's quite an ample selection, 200+ letters with a lot of historical commentary and essays. But the thing that's actually been of greatest interest in recent years has been the database of Catherine the Great, and that is a slide of the front web page, which perhaps if I'm able to connect to the internet later, I'll be able to show you a live demonstration. So in the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about how digital humanities in a database of this kind can help students of Russia in the 18th century, students of a vast corpus of letters. And then in the second part of the lecture, I'm going actually to talk about networking, how Catherine used her correspondence to achieve some important milestones in her reign. And on the question of center and periphery, where is the center of the Enlightenment, where is the periphery, the outside ring of the Enlightenment, the correspondence tells an interesting story, because if you were just to look, not at where Catherine is physically on the map, but if you were to look at her in terms of her networks, and so I'm going to use social network analysis to describe the correspondence, you might say that Catherine is really at the center of the Enlightenment and not at the boundary. So let me talk a little bit about this database. And the history of the database is known to some of you, and I'm not going to go into that there. If you have any questions about how the project arose, how it was funded, I'm happy to talk about. Although I will show you some of the preparatory material. So this CatCor, Correspondence of Catherine the Great, is a digital resource. You can see CatCor stands for Correspondence of Catherine. It was our acronym. But in fact, I had to think. We were approaching a funding body to make an application, and I was sitting in a cafe in Paris, and I needed a short name, for the digital correspondence of Catherine the Great, and I just ordered a piece of CatCor. And it's a nice story, but it's true. And I thought, CatCor, why not? The database is a pilot project to help us read and search a vast body of letters, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 letters of Catherine the Great, which has never been collected into a proper scholarly edition. In fact, most of which is not really available. This is partly because the dispersion of the letters after her death. Her son Paul, so just to perhaps lay the groundwork now and perhaps recapitulate a little bit of what I said last week, for those of you who were not here. Her son Paul tried to destroy her legacy after her death, and her letters remained unpublished and discussed. And it was really not until the 1860s, until the Russian Revolution, that the letters began to appear in journals. Journals that were dedicated, essentially they're archival journals that aim to publish documents. So the letters were published, sometimes single letters at a time, sometimes entire groups, without commentary. And these letters remain very, very hard to use because these journals are quite rare. The 19th century transcriptions are pretty accurate, but there are over 70 different journals or different outlets for Catherine's letters. And so, as you can imagine, it's hard to find libraries that contain all 70. The journals have been scanned in recent years, but badly, and they are not searchable. There are some separate editions of Catherine's letters. There's letters to Voltaire, Potemkin, Deline, and Gustav III of Sweden. I talked a bit about those last week. But this all matters because an awful lot is written about Catherine the Great. There are many, many biographies. Scarcely a year goes by without a biography. Scarcely a year goes by without some political study of her reign. And scarcely a year goes by without a discussion of whether Russia was enlightened or not. And it's always with reference to Catherine's policies. She reigned, as you know, for 34 years, from 1762 to 1796, and oversaw massive transformation of the country. And yet the letters are hardly ever used. They're very rarely cited. Only very few are used in any of these studies. Just to give you one example of where the correspondence might change our view on Catherine's management of her country, as well as intellectual issues, really across the entire range of issues that come into play in discussing the reign of Catherine the Great. Consider her response to the French Revolution in the 1790s. Now, hundreds of letters were written by, well, not just by Catherine, by many, many participants, and contributed to networks in which she participated. The starting point for any discussion of Catherine and the French Revolution is the basic premise that by this point she was a woman in her 60s, and therefore old, tired, inactive, past her prime, and basically extremely conservative. So the standard view of Catherine is that she met the revolution with horror, with fear, and basically didn't react. In fact, if you look at the letters, you find a much more fluid and complex understanding of contemporary events and her attitudes to ideas and politics. Almost month by month, her attitude changes and her actions also change. And it's the letters that make accessible to us the true nature of her policy. So in one month, the complete works of Voltaire are burned in St. Petersburg. In another month, she allows the publication of other quite radical things. There's an inconsistency there that really does need to be explored. And it's the subject of the letters and networks into which her correspondence is participating. So that's just one example. There are many, many other examples of how an accessible and usable edition of the correspondence can make available a major source on a whole range of issues. Now, how many letters did Catherine write is an obvious question, and I said probably somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 signed letters. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But as I said last week, we don't actually have a complete list, an inventory of Catherine the Great's letters. And here is, so one thing that Kelsey and I, but mainly Kelsey actually, in conjunction with another project in Oxford, a much bigger project called Early Modern Letters Online, EMLO, we've been trying to compile the metadata of her letters, which is actually to compile an annotated list that records all the metadata, meaning author, it's as we define it, but it'll be author, place they're writing from, date, recipient, location of recipient, and of course, source. And one of the things you can do with the metadata, as people like our colleague Glenn Rowe, and Nicholas, and others here know, one of the things you can do with metadata is you can map metadata. You can use them actually to visualize a correspondence, to give a sense of the extent of a correspondence and how it works. And this is the map that corresponds to our metadata so far. And depending on the variables that you plug in, some of these lines will disappear. Some will grow more dense and have dots on them to, I suppose, visualize the number of letters that travel from one point to another. But I think the really interesting thing is you can see where the epicenter of the correspondence is, and that's Catherine the Great, who is the source of all these letters. And I'm going to talk about her and the correspondence in networking terms in a few minutes. But I think I said last week that if you were to look at a book by Jonathan Israel, so the Radical Enlightenment, a very famous and much contested and discussed book, when he draws a map of Europe in the Enlightenment, he does include St. Petersburg, and it's sort of one little dot, it's not connected, and it's just out there as a place that's not really within the fold of nations during the Enlightenment. If you were to measure the engagement of Russia, then there are different criteria, of course. But if you were to measure the degree of engagement that Catherine the Great has with Europeans of many, many kinds, and I will in a minute talk a little bit about her networks, the different kinds of networks, you can see that this is an amazingly extensive, plugged-in network. I mean, I don't know what this would look like in Facebook terms, but you wouldn't say that this is somebody who's not with it, right? You would say they're quite plugged in. I don't know what the French terminology is for someone who uses Facebook a lot, but branché, elle était très, très branchée, l'impératrice. So metadata can tell us an awful lot, but they can also help us visualize how the correspondence work. Now, the research tool we've created only has about 300 letters in it, out of 8,000 to 10,000. And those letters were drawn from 2 years in her reign, 1774 and 1790 to 91. Those were particularly sensitive years. But even, despite the fact that we only have a very small cross-section, statistically small sample, and some people here will know that Voltaire wrote 18,000 letters, although Nicholas Cronk is discovering new letters all the time, so the number keeps moving. But one of the things we're able to do, even with this small sample, is to gather statistics, to compile data tables, to do a timeline, to filter letters by people, place, events, objects, as I'll show you in a minute. And this does really change one's perspective on things. When I come to the main part of the lecture, I'm going to produce a case study. And there you can see, I mean, people read a lot in the newspapers at the moment about back-channeling. There's all the kind of international relations that happen that we read about on the front pages of newspapers, but then through diplomats or leaders call one another off-piste, and this is back-channeling. And we can see actually from the case study I'll produce that Catherine is really very, very skillful at back-channeling. And it does matter, it makes an enormous difference. Now, get rid of the map. So if we just look a little bit, if we were online, I would show you, so here's a letter, just to show you a little bit about how the database was put together and worked. Here's just a piece of text produced from an OCS scan. So we scanned the 19th century editions. We then corrected them and produced text. And then the text was tagged using, so it's, I'm not sure I can magnify that, but you can see that there's code in here. Actually, it's very, very small. I'm really sorry about that. It's the best I could do. But you can see all the blue and purple color is essentially tagging. So we tag certain elements of a letter. And that enables you to do certain functions. Well, that's the timeline as it used to be. But if you want to do a search, for instance, of people, so a prosopography, who is mentioned in the letters of Catherine the Great? Here is an example. The computer, the database generated this list for us. That's only, you've only got, well, you've got a list that was compiled on the basis of, at that point, it was probably only 150 letters when I took this slide. But very often, it's quite surprising to see who turns up, who is mentioned. These are not always people whose names appear in standard histories, or somehow they get a bit lost. So trying fully to capture the range of reference is one thing, helping to capture the range of reference. And then the database helps us. So if you were to do a search for a particular topic or a particular person, so in this case, I think this was a title. What was it I was looking for here? I can't remember. It might have been the two. Well, it might have been Voltaire. So the number of times Voltaire is mentioned, not in the letters that Catherine and Voltaire exchanged. They wrote to one another about nearly 80 times. But outside the correspondence, to see how often Catherine is mentions Voltaire in writing to other people, this is one of the things you can do with the database, which would be impossible to do with the editions that we have. Then just to dwell a bit more, yes, so there are subject lists, and you can see there are different ways of organizing the data, and just helpful quantifications. What else can we? And then, of course, we have the text themselves of the letters, which are annotated, and you can see these are our notes. These are links within the database to a prosopography at the back, which gives you information about these figures. We don't have any hyperlinks as yet, but someday, in a perfect world, we'll have hyperlinks to other resources. Here's an example of how a note will work. And so you can see, and I'm going to talk about this marriage. That's the case study, the marriage of Grand Duke Paul, who's Catherine's heir, an only legitimate child, and how the marriage was arranged. So there's a letter which mentions Natalia Alexeyevna, and the database gives you a bit of information. Let's go quickly through this. There's another letter. There's one of her letters. So Catherine the Great's daughter-in-law. Here's a letter about Diderot, and that's an English translation. So we try to provide translations into English as well. But then if you don't want to read letters, but you just want actually, so mine is perhaps too great, grander term to use for such a small corpus. But if you actually want to analyze on the basis of certain categories, then the taggings allow the researcher to do that. And let me see, there are quite a lot of slides here. So take something like this, a topical analysis. So you tick the box, and you want to find out what was written by Catherine the Great about the Pugachev rebellion. So there was a rebellion in Russia in 1774. It was a mass movement. It was a really, really quite disturbing, and it took a major military effort to contain this rebellion. And it's not you know, one can identify the letters Catherine wrote on the subject, but then if one's looking at who else was writing about it, how the revolt was perceived in Europe, who knew about it, what was being reported, and Catherine is terribly aware of her image abroad, and questions of foreign policy and the connection to her own status, then of course one wants to canvass, one wants to try to search as large a network outside Catherine's own immediate correspondences as possible. And so a database allows us to do that. And I think it's not, you can see all the uses this would have. Now, that's the next, okay. Right, so there are lots of research questions that can be asked using a tool like this. Some of them can possibly be answered. But I think the obvious point, or maybe it isn't an obvious point, but the important thing is to argue that being able to collect or bring together and analyze so much material is bound to shed new light on the period, on the reign. It makes available you know, massively a large corpus of texts that are not known. It tells us about a whole range of issues: court culture, patronage, self-image, femininity, Catherine's, because some of the letters are personal, so the barriers between private and public also very, very important. And of course, there's a bigger international picture here, which is, you know, how Catherine is not just positioning herself vis-a-vis Europe, but how she's using her correspondence to interact and be part of the European cultural scene all the time, which takes us back to this. Now, if we want to think about who some of the recipients are, then I think we need to think in terms of, or it's helpful to think in terms of networks. And Catherine, now we know that Voltaire wrote to, I think I said 18,000 letters, I think it's more like 15,000, but apparently he wrote to about 1,800 people. Catherine wrote probably to 400 people, a much smaller number, 200 of whom would have received autographed letters from her. And in a few minutes I'll talk about the status of the autograph and why it matters. So they're all told, there's a set of about 400 addressees. Some of her correspondence fall into what we would call military command structures. So a whole group of people to whom she writes repeatedly because she's giving them military orders. And she's a real micromanager. She knows exactly where her troops are, what they're doing. She writes a lot about ships and naval detachments and flotillas and individual generals and sailors. And she depends enormously on her intelligence networks for this information. Diplomatic networks. I'll show a slide in a minute that contains some of her ambassadors. Particularly important are Dmitry Golitsyn, who was known to Diderot, and is, in addition to being a diplomat, is a geologist, a scientist. There's the Russian ambassador to Great Britain, Semyon Vorontsov, who's particularly important to her as a channel in the 1790s on trade negotiations and I suppose, negotiations about certain territories that are still being contested close to the North Pole. Administrative institutions staffed by governors and judges, ecclesiastical hierarchies, and court advisors. These are all people who form a network. They write to one another, and Catherine writes to them. The question, does she write to, you know, well, we'll talk about how letters move around. Does a letter to A then move horizontally to other people or not? The most exclusive network or group to which Catherine belonged was the intermonarchical network that linked Europe's heads of state. So she's comparable to other 18th century enlightened monarchs, especially Frederick II of Prussia, in making letters a vehicle of public policy and pragmatic matters. So that would also include Gustav III of Sweden among Those are the two. Frederick and Gustav are Joseph II as well. Those are the three monarchs with whom she actually corresponds. For the most part, though, her letters to these figures are handled by her apparatus. They're written by her secretaries. And although they may be signed by her, they really are, they contain formal announcements, responses to births and deaths, and marriages. So they are letters, but they're not of the same type of the letters I'm most interested in. The best known of all Catherine's networks are comprised of addressees, foreign individuals who are intellectuals. I suppose cultural figures like Voltaire, like Madame Jaffrin, like d'Alembert, like Marmontel, like Falconet, who comes to work for her. And she writes to Falconet when he's still in Russia. She has a correspondence with Falconet even when he's in St. Petersburg. And so we might say this is a single network, not by virtue of the correspondence, but by virtue of their own, as it were, professions, métier. They're all belonging to a single, as it were, sphere, which we could call the sphere of culture. Or they're not all philosophes, but many of them are philosophes. And so that group forms a particularly important network when talking about Catherine and the Enlightenment. Okay, so I think that pretty much exhausts the more technical side of the presentation today. And I thought it would be building on that and using an article that Kelsey and I have written together. I thought it might be of interest, I was hoping it would be of interest, to talk about Catherine and the art of epistolary networking, particularly in an age when people use tweets, Facebook, all sorts of things to stay connected. The Empress of Russia felt she felt a great urgency about remaining connected all the time through letters. And last week I talked about how she learned the art of letter writing and what's characteristic of her letter writing, how her letters are structured, why they're literary. And this week I'm actually going to talk more about how letters move around and what they do, what the purpose is. And I think this lecture, therefore, offers an analysis of the epistolary network of Catherine the Great, who arguably is the most effective letter writer of the 18th century. And I mean effective in the pragmatic sense of actually getting an awful lot done. So the first part of this part of the presentation will provide an overview of Catherine's network using the basic concepts of social network analysis, highlighting new facets of her epistolary practice that this perspective brings to the fore, as well as the method's limitations. So trying, I think, to identify what it can't do, and also sketching out further analyses that more digitized and readily processed data would enable. So if we had, for instance, a complete version of CatCor, that would be great. But it would be so much better if we also had a complete database of Frederick the Great's correspondence, and one could add a number of other important correspondences. And then the second part of the lecture will focus on an illustration in which Catherine demonstrates her acute sensitivity to the opportunities and pitfalls, dangers of epistolary networking in the 18th century. So two guiding notions in the essay will be, or in this lecture, will be power and prestige. Everybody understands those words, but what they mean in the period and what they mean to Catherine needs to be historicized. Catherine's position of power, both real and desired, defined the underlying structure of the network that she had at her disposal and that she could expand as she pursued her imperial ambitions. She might have been an absolute monarch, but she wasn't absolutely powerful, either in her own country or abroad. And so one of the things we see in the letters is, of course, attempts to secure, stabilize, and augment her power for particular aims. Prestige is part of cultural capital. It's symbolic and it's harder, of course, it's not like the conquest of a country. It's much harder to calibrate. But it's a term that, for the purposes of this paper, we can use in its technical meaning within social network analysis, which means receiving more directed ties than one initiates in the network. And in its more general acceptation, reputation, fame, and prominence. So within the network, she receives more correspondence material than anyone else in the entire that entire domain. But of course, prestige also matters in the more familiar sense of fame. And the term describes what Catherine gave to and gained from her correspondence through their exchange. By the 18th century, all European monarchs relied heavily on collecting and circulating information by letter. In their study of Louis XIV's bureaucracy, John C. Rule and Ben S. Trotter write of the, quote, communication network essential to the efficient and effective function of all the departments and indeed to the very existence of a modern state, the heart of which was the postal system. The postal system in Russia then and the postal system in Russia now is not very good. A few exemplary enlightened absolutists like Catherine and Frederick the Great made the most of this situation. They used their pens not only to master the state apparatus, but also to reach beyond it and to project their influence and present themselves as celebrities on the world stage. Much was at stake for Catherine especially. Epistolary networking within and beyond Russia allowed her to overcome the disadvantages of her position and consolidate her power. Whereas Frederick, a man who legitimately inherited a kingdom at the center of Europe, whereas he was a legitimate heir, Catherine was a female usurper on the throne of a giant, underdeveloped empire located on the geographical, cultural, and political periphery of Europe. She oversaw substantial territorial expansion of her empire, extensive legislative reforms, and the blossoming of a European-style cultural sphere, all of which had been nearly unthinkable in Russia only 3/4 of a century before. So I think if one thinks of people often think of Peter the Great as the transformer of Russia. I think the distinction is between Peter the Great as the modernizer of Russia and Catherine the Great as somebody who dedicates resources to Europeanizing its culture and its cultural potential. Her mastery of the art of epistolary networking was instrumental to her success. It allowed her to accomplish her tasks as an empress and to project her power and influence across the empire and across Europe. Now, as I've just been saying, the patchiness of currently available databases means that digital methods cannot yet trace fully the strategies of Catherine and her many interlocutors. And so until more digital projects are designed to bring together correspondences from all domains of activity, from government to culture and personal life, the traditional approach of sifting through multiple printed editions remains essential. If you want to reconstruct exactly what happened in an episode, an important episode, you need to use printed sources more than digital sources, but something, as we'll see, I've got a hybrid model here, and CatCor helps a lot. So Catherine's correspondences can be read as the most basic unit of social network analysis, an egocentric network comprising the empress and all those to whom she wrote personally. So the network emanates from her. This group consists of at least 220 people for whom the printed or manuscript record contains either a letter or draft, partially or completely in Catherine's hand. The distinction between autograph letter and those written in the hand of a secretary and merely signed by the empress is highly significant in purely quantitative terms. If we include letters in a secretarial hand, the number nearly doubles to 427. That's 427 recipients. Qualitatively, too, the distinction between autograph and secretarial letters is far more meaningful in the correspondence of a monarch than in that of a commoner, even a commoner as illustrious as Voltaire. Secretaries generally composed the ruler's more routine correspondence and/or copied out formal letters from the ruler's drafts. Some secretarial letters had the value of legal or quasi-legal orders, while other such missives were formulaic greetings, such as official announcements, condolences, and congratulations. When the sovereign wrote in her own hand, she did so as a mark of honor for the addressee. So talked a little bit about cultural capital and prestige. So signing a letter making it clear that it's an autograph is an honor. It's a sign of the special importance she attaches to the matters being discussed in the letter, or when her relationship with the addressee was more than merely official. So letters bearing the traces of Catherine's autograph more reliably reflect her intentions and activities. The relatively small number of autograph correspondence should not surprise us. It was a matter of prestige, and in the parlance of social network analysis, Catherine was a correspondent with exceptionally high prestige. That is, she received an unmanageably large number of directed ties. She received large letters from very large numbers of people. She received letters from very large number of peoples, but she initiated relatively few. And she maintained very few reciprocal exchanges. So the correspondences with Voltaire and Marmontel are quite unusual. Her greatest correspondence, reciprocal correspondences with her lover, and then, most important, Minister Potiomkin, and with Melchior Grimm, about whom I'll say a few things in a minute. So one need only consider the fact that in 1763, right at the beginning of her reign, Catherine had to institute the position of state secretary. She created the position of state secretaries to cope with correspondence. This had not been done. These posts did not exist before, and throughout her reign, she had 3 or more such secretaries whose primary task was to help her way through the masses of incoming correspondence. The same phenomenon can be found in the cultural domain. Her favorite correspondent was the German journalist and courtier living in Paris, Friedrich Melchior Grimm, who was in Russian employ from 1777 onward. His duties included not only managing Catherine's purchases of foreign artworks, but also sorting through the letters and requests she received from writers and artists eager for patronage. As a result, only the number of outgoing letters is truly indicative of Catherine's personal engagement and correspondence, because many would have been filtered through Grimm and 3 other secretaries. The limitation on the number of addressees was also a matter of prestige in the more common sense. To receive an autograph letter from a monarch was an extraordinary privilege that she carefully managed, thereby limiting the risks of unwanted circulation of autograph letters and preserving the air of exclusivity associated with the autograph. The most notorious instance of her defense of the imperial autograph is her refusal to send a second letter to the Russian writer Alexander Sumarokov. Sumarokov was a playwright, an imitator of Voltaire. He wrote a letter to Voltaire, which you can find in the Voltaire Foundation Bodleian Enlightenment Correspondence database. But Sumarokov was the first director of the Imperial Theatre in St. Petersburg, and he was a difficult person to manage. And he caused a lot of trouble. And so he wrote to Catherine, petitioning her and complaining, and she replied. He then wrote a second time, and we have a letter not written to Sumarokov, but written to her secretary, Kazitsky, who was also an interesting man of letters. And she basically says, I'm not writing to him, because to write to him will only give him an unrealistic sense of his importance and will encourage him to continue these disputes with the management of the Imperial Theatre. And so she says to her secretary, write to him that I received his letters and that I am not going to answer them, so that copies of my letters do not again annoy him. So she's afraid that if she writes to him, her letters to him will be copied by other people and will be referred back to him, and copied into other letters encouraging him to pursue the lawsuit he had actually brought against someone in St. Petersburg. So she withdraws her hand from imperial circulation and defends it from further involvement in an ugly personal quarrel. In fact, compared to other earlier monarchs, Catherine wrote to an exceptional number of correspondents in her own hand. In the 16th century, even the very active epistolary queen, Catherine de' Medici, wrote only 819 of her surviving 5,958 letters in her own hand, while in the 17th century, the archetype of the absolute monarch, Louis XIV, had detailed protocols delimiting the small group of elite recipients worthy of receiving a genuine autograph letter. So Catherine writes to a much larger group. The freeing of the royal hand was a general feature of the 18th century, when both monarchs and commoners began to write more frequently than ever before. And on the subject of the royal hand, just if we go back to the old technology. If we go back to the cover of this book, you can see up here, there is the royal hand. I'm not sure the designer paid much attention to the contents, but that's a good piece of design, isn't it? One can't imagine Catherine actually having such elegant hands, so well manicured, but we don't know. Catherine occupied an almost unique position as a node in, it's a horrible term, but as a node in at least 7 different types of networks, many of which were mutually exclusive for correspondence of lower rank. So her role as monarch placed her necessarily within the multiple networks of governance, internal administrative networks. So these are letters to and from local governors in the provinces. And I won't bore you with all the names. There are diplomatic networks. I've mentioned a couple of recipients already. There's also her ambassador in Constantinople, who occupies a terribly important position. If you remember, she waged 2 wars against the Ottoman Empire. There are courtly networks, so nobles who did not necessarily engage in administration, but were in the inner circle of the empress. In fact, even played cards with her in the Hermitage. There are favorites, lovers, but also people she relies on. And then there are the crowned heads of state, and these include Frederick, George III of England, she calls him le bon citoyen, and the Holy Roman Empress and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, Maria Theresa. And there's also, of course, Caroline of Hesse-Darmstadt is a friend, and then there are family members as well. And there's no reason to assume that any members of any one of these networks would be involved in any other network. So a local governor would have had no reason to write to the Russian ambassador in Paris unless they were personal friends. A courtier would address a foreign monarch only with the approval of his own sovereign. And even an ordinary queen consort, so meaning Natalia Alexeyevna, about whom I'll talk, would probably not correspond directly with local administrators. It's only Catherine, a ruling monarch like Catherine, who would combine them. Yet Catherine also added 3 other types of networks to her repertory. There's the parental, there's the amorous, and there's the cultural. So Frederick the Great, although he had an extensive familial exchange with his siblings, he did not have children of his own. Catherine wrote regularly to her son and daughters-in-law, inviting them to court functions or telling them about what she saw on her journeys. Later in life, she relished her role as grandmother, writing endearing notes to her grandchildren, but mainly to her 2 grandsons, to thank them for the letters they practiced writing as part of their education. And it's worth, that's a completely different topic, but their education, you know, they were tutored by La Harpe, and they read Télémaque by Fénelon, and so the question of royal education was terribly important, and Catherine supervised this. As for her amorous correspondence, her sexual promiscuity did not match that of Louis XV, but he was not as great a writer as Catherine, and so he left no love letters like Catherine's. Catherine's love letters are very enjoyable to read. They're full of good humor, and they're full of touching affection and intimacy. They're a real insight, I think, into her personality. Even though she knows they're being read, they're filtered. 3 different people will. So if she's in one part of the Hermitage and writes to Potyomkin, who's in his bedroom on the other side of the Hermitage, and tries to send a little note, unless she sent it with one of her dogs, which I've not heard of, you know, I don't think she trained them to deliver, to be postmen, then she knows that even a little billet doux is going to be read by 2 or 3 people and probably noted down somewhere. So one has to manipulate that side of things. Corresponding with cultural figures all across Europe, as she did, was far from ordinary practice for a monarch, even for an enlightened one. So if one can single out Gustav III of Sweden, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and the latter's sister, Wilhelmine of Brandenburg-Bayreuth, who wrote to writers like Voltaire, one could also name Maria Theresa and Joseph II as 2 relatively enlightened monarchs who paid little heed to the aesthetic qualities of their letters and had no literary contacts. So she's unusual in that respect. So participation in literary exchange while it was not a requirement for becoming an enlightened monarch, it offered a wide field for networking and circulation of prestige that monarchs forfeited if they remained within the standard sphere of official and familial correspondence. So she understands the prestige of acquiring Voltaire's library. She understands the prestige of buying Diderot's library, but she knows these things have to be mentioned and written about and discussed. Catherine's position of power made her curiously both essential and inessential to the functioning of her network. She was rarely a cut point in any network, as I'll show in a minute. In other words, letters to others don't pass through her. Her letter writing almost ran in parallel lines to the more regular correspondence of her subordinates, so that if we removed her from the exchange, we would not interrupt the continuity of the network around her, these other people who are corresponding about her, but to one another, but not really through her. So she's not, as I said, she's essential, but also inessential in terms of mapping. Everyday diplomatic correspondence usually took place between the Russian representative in a given city and officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs in St. Petersburg. Important orders would bear the monarch's signature, but were usually in a secretarial hand, so the autographs don't really figure there. Often very long and detailed, these orders were typically produced in collaboration by the ruler and her advisors. Catherine intervened in her own hand very rarely, often adding an autograph note to the end of a long official dispatch to clarify her position on a matter or to make a gesture of a special goodwill towards an ambassador. Her personal interventions may have made a powerful impression on their recipients, but by the measure of the social network analysis, the network would have remained intact and even strongly connected without her personal presence within it. And yet Catherine was absolutely essential to the continuity of the network. Although it was not always visible as lines on a graph, hers was the will that guided and approved of her subordinates' actions, and that thereby kept the entire network going. So if we were to visualize this, so you can see on this graph, lots of familiar figures, sort of in the outer ring. These are obviously French correspondents, all of whose names I mentioned earlier. Closer to home are figures who sometimes act as intermediaries, sometimes, but also, as we can see, most of the lines are drawn directly between Catherine and individuals. But you can see that, so Shuvalov acts as a cut point, as it were. Catherine herself never passes on any of their letters to anybody else. So she generates, but she doesn't act within the network itself to move information, at least not directly. And we'll see why this matters shortly. This represents a set of figures with whom she was regularly in touch between 1762 and 1774. She corresponded directly with every individual in the network, with a group of Russian subjects or employees. So Pictet, who's an acquaintance of Voltaire, was briefly her secretary, so he worked for her, and with a group of prominent French cultural figures beyond them, as we can see here. And so you can see a number of lines. There are a number of intermediaries leading to Voltaire on the left, but the main route, as it were, is the blue line connecting Catherine and Voltaire. That's where all the direct correspondence travels. And these initial letters that go through Shuvalov, the two Shuvalovs actually, and Pictet, they're at the very start of her relationship with Voltaire. I think they even predate. She's still the Grand Duchess at that point. So, as I said, if we eliminated her, this network would fall apart, and yet she doesn't have to serve as a cut point in the network. She used these intermediaries. Why are they there? Why didn't she write directly in the first place? Well, partly she used them for reasons of tact, to sound out potential correspondence, whether they actually wanted to hear from her, whether they wanted to be in personal exchange with her. And that includes Voltaire, it includes Geoffrin, Betskoy, who is mentioned here on the right, is an important figure in linking, and he's an educational theorist as well as minister. He's an important figure in affecting her acquaintance with Falconet, Geoffrin, and Diderot. So on the one hand, her presence here looks quite gratuitous. On the other hand, it's absolutely clear that were it not for her interests, these people might not be corresponding with one another in quite the same way. And they might actually not even be able to make contact with one another. For instance, consider the case of, let's see, Galitzin. So Galitzin approaches, Galitzin, who's the Russian ambassador in Paris at this time, clearly gained in prestige and was able to approach d'Alembert and Falconet because he was the Empress's emissary. But he was also able to approach them and ask them whether they would welcome letters from her. And he's well respected as an intellectual. Diderot, so in a letter to Falconet, which Diderot wrote, obviously aware that Catherine the Great would read it, Diderot explains the process of how of how the network, as it were, expands and incorporates people. So Diderot explains the process in his description of Galitzin's situation. Il ne saurait faire un pas, il ne saurait entrer dans une seule maison sans y entendre l'éloge d'une souveraine qu'il adore. Mais dites-moi, je vous prie, si c'est sa faute à lui que sa maîtresse soit grande. So flattery should be read, the flattery should be read with caution, but it implies that Catherine might have seen, that might have been, goes off rather quickly, behind the promotion, okay, so that it's Catherine who's pushing Galitzin to make these acquaintances in Paris. So the way it's done is not the Empress would like to write a letter to you, but don't you think Catherine is wonderful? And there's a code of praise. The makeup of Catherine's network emphasizes once more the importance of her position of power in determining the extent and shape of her network. There's a distinct gender imbalance in her correspondence. Of the 220 addressees whom the Empress honored with an autograph intervention in the network, only 22, 10%, were women. However, proportionally, a woman was far more likely to receive an autograph than a man. There are only 28 women in the larger group of 427 addressees, so fewer than 7%, meaning that 79% of the women to whom Catherine wrote received autographs. By contrast, only about half the men to whom Catherine wrote received letters in her own hand. Catherine's female addressees were far more likely to fall into the categories most appropriate for autograph communication. Family members like her mother, in-laws and granddaughters, personal friends, whether at court or from her childhood. Female monarchs like Maria Theresa, and the effective, if not official, ruler of Denmark, the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria. And interestingly, cultural figures like Geoffrin, like the German writer Elise von der Ecke, about whom I talked last time, and Voltaire's niece and companion, Marie-Louise Denis. The latter was honored with a single autograph letter after Voltaire's death. The overall proportion of women to men therefore reflects the preponderance of Catherine's official function as empress in the formation of her epistolary corpus. Only about a quarter of her autograph correspondence can be classified as more or less personal, such as family members, lovers, personal friends, doctors, or cultural figures, with whom her exchanges were ostentatiously personal in tone. The rest had official ties. I think I'll skip this bit with more statistics. But yes, so I've mentioned, yes, I think I'm going to move on a bit. So let's move on to the case study, because the case study actually shows us how the correspondence works in action and how different networks can run in parallel and disseminate different information. So if we can use these techniques to show in action how Catherine placed herself in a position of power within multiple networks and garnered prestige even during difficult political situations. In the years 1772 to 1774, I've already said there was a rebellion, Catherine faced a court crisis at home and a war against the Ottoman Empire that she'd been fighting since 1768. Unsupported and even opposed by her primary ally, Frederick the Great. Frederick had, so not a very faithful ally, Frederick had received a certain amount of territorial satisfaction from the first partition of Poland in 1772. But he continued pressuring Catherine to give up her Ottoman conquests and constantly searched for ways to impede his allies' ever-growing international clout. At home, Catherine's son, the future Emperor Paul, turned 18 in September 1772, raising the very real spectre of a plot to place him on the throne in her stead. Many in Russia believed that Catherine should have ruled only as regent for her late husband's underage heir, and several conspiracies were quashed around the time of his majority. And when I talk about Radishev in the fourth of these lectures, I'll talk a little bit about the question of timing and how timing matters and the way in which we assess reputations of writers who were seen as radical. In fact, suggestions that were made in one part of a reign that might have, suggestions that might have looked radical in one part of a reign could potentially have looked quite acceptable to an absolute ruler at another moment. But in 1772, Catherine is worried about her position on the throne. So she's in a hurry to marry Paul I off, to get him off her hands, to confirm his status as heir rather than ruler, and to keep him busy producing new Romanovs. After several years of considerations, her choice fell on Princess Wilhelmine, the daughter of Ludwig IX, Landgrave of Hesse-Darmstadt. Wilhelmine was also Frederick the Great's preference, since he saw an opportunity to bind Russia to Prussian interests for many years to come. Wilhelmine's father was in Austrian service, but her family had long-standing ties to Prussia, and her sister Frederica was married to Frederick's nephew and heir, the future Frederick William II. So there's a family connection there already. So politically, Catherine was pleased to reassure Frederick of her loyalty to their alliance through a demonstration of affection, but without giving an inch of territory. She might please him, in, I suppose, affective terms, but frustrate him because he'd frustrated her as an ally. She firmly intended to minimize any Prussian influence on Russian affairs that Frederick had promised himself from the match. So she's playing a complicated game. She's willing to choose a bride for Paul who is more than acceptable to Frederick. In fact, he would be Frederick's preferred choice, but she wants to be the manipulator and lay down the terms, not Frederick. So she's fighting fire with fire. How does she do it? And only the letters will tell us. And what I'm about to read might be sensationally uninteresting to you, or it might be sensationally interesting, I don't know. But it's not anything you can find anywhere else, because people haven't really delved into what's going on here. Because they haven't read the letters. In October, November of 1772, Catherine's intermediaries extended to Wilhelmine's mother, Caroline Henrietta, Landgravine of Hesse-Darmstadt, an invitation to visit St. Petersburg with her 3 unmarried daughters. So the letter goes out to the mother of the would-be bride to come with all 3 young ladies. Catherine wished to give the impression of selecting one of the sisters based on their personal qualities, but Wilhelmine was by far the favorite due to her age. And there's an element of wanting to unnerve Frederick a little bit by keeping him guessing. Her sister Amalie was a few months older than Paul, which made her seem an inappropriate match, while Louise was 3 years younger than Paul, and therefore less mature and a less suitable bride than Wilhelmine. Having long desired such a marriage for one of her girls, Caroline eagerly accepted the invitation, and in May 1773 set out for Russia. She stopped in Berlin on the way for final consultation with Frederick. So very important. She's making sure she's touching base with him. Then she arrives in St. Petersburg in June 1773. On the 15th of August 1773, Wilhelmine converted to Russian Orthodoxy, just as Catherine the Great had done 30 years earlier, and assumed the name of Grand Duchess Natalia Alexeyevna, and on the 29th of September married Paul in a series of lavish celebrations. Caroline left Russia already on the 15th of October. So Wilhelmine's mother left Russia on 15th of October, passing through Berlin again on her way home to Darmstadt. Her health was severely weakened by the journey, and she died shortly after her return in late March 1774. Caroline's death and Natalia Alexeyevna's death 2 years later spelled failure for Frederick's plans. And in 1776, Catherine quickly remarried her son to another favored candidate, Sophie Dorothea of Württemberg. In the months immediately following the marriage, meanwhile, the original marriage, it became increasingly important for Catherine to keep public attention focused on this positive display of imperial wealth, power, and sophistication. So, as I said, there's a domestic crisis. Catherine, on all fronts, is really facing serious challenges, and a royal wedding does a lot at court to give the impression of being in control, even though Cossacks, peasants, are rebelling in the southern provinces of the empire in September of 1773. Catherine's epistolary networking surrounding the marriage was also a transformative moment for the way in which she used her correspondence. So 3 distinct strands can be traced in how Catherine used her networks on this occasion. The first, her royal correspondences. She used her royal correspondences to strike a delicate balance between reassuring her Prussian allies through new epistolary and matrimonial bonds on the one hand, and affirming her independence and superiority on the other. So she says, yes, we have the same candidate, but I'm in charge. Second, her instructions to her subordinates and representatives from whom she asserted her power and control over unfolding events. So there are various moments, as we'll see, during the courtship when Frederick and his agents try to manipulate things, and she is very good at repelling them. And then third, her multi-directional efforts to publicize the wedding as a display of Russia's and her own prestige. And it was in the latter domain that the marriage had its most lasting effect. It was on this occasion that Catherine began the most exceptional epistolary exchange of her life with her ideal cultural intermediary, Grimm, who, as I'll explain. In her royal correspondences, that is, in her exchanges with the figures most directly implicated in the familial bonds being formed, Catherine had to fend off the attempt by Frederick the Great, another shrewd letter writer, to entrap her within a network he controlled. His significant effort can be traced in his correspondence with his longtime friend, Caroline of Hesse-Darmstadt, 2/3 of which relate in some way to her daughter's Russian marriage. So Frederick and Caroline were very close. In his frequent letters, beginning in May of 1772, Frederick tried to impress upon Caroline that he was the matchmaker whom she had to thank for her daughter's great future in Russia. As he put it, with his usual mixture of crudeness and gallantry, Mon maquerellage sera bien récompensé si, en menant votre fille pour la placer sur ce trône, vous me faites le plaisir chez moi. Catherine almost certainly had seen a copy of that letter. Catherine was acutely aware of Frederick's claims and explicitly denied them in an autograph note confirming her choice of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt, which she probably wrote for a member of her staff. Je ne m'arrête pas beaucoup sur les louanges données à l'aînée des princesses de Hesse par le roi de Prusse. Difficilement, ce qui est de son goût nous accommoderait. She made no such claims in public. Politically, it was much wiser to let Frederick think that he would make the choice, while Catherine quietly escaped his grip and asserted her own power. Caroline's visit to the Prussian king at Berlin and Potsdam was customary. Nearly 30 years before, Catherine herself had done the same in the company of her own mother as she traveled to Russia for her marriage to the heir to the throne. On both occasions, Frederick wanted to brief the mother on how best to serve Prussian interests at the Russian court. But this time, he and his brother Henry had insider information to share with Caroline. Henry had just been to Russia, and we have some of Henry's letters in CatCor, so this is when I was writing this part of the paper, how sort of unpick this. Henry had visited Russia in 1770, 1771, and his knowledge of the Russian court's abundant factions and intrigues gave the Prussian brothers hope of successfully guiding Caroline on the alliances she was supposed to form at court to further the interests of Frederick. Paul I, in every respect, is a great admirer of Frederick and imitates him, plays with toy soldiers wearing Prussian costumes, is obsessed with Prussian military. And Catherine, of course, has a very, very difficult contest going on in different arenas with Frederick. The fact that her son and only heir is an admirer of her greatest rival is a very difficult position to be in, which is why the diplomacy around this marriage matters a great deal, because she understands that Caroline is bringing with her, or Wilhelmine is bringing with her, allies and spies who will report back to Frederick. So on her departure from their court, on Caroline's departure from Frederick and Henry's court, both brothers gave her enthusiastic letters of recommendation to carry to Catherine. 18th century travelers rarely ventured forth without such letters, and letter writers developed a whole set of devices to alert recipients if their recommendations had been forced, extorted, or were in some way less than genuine and enthusiastic. Frederick filled his letter with one of his usual inflated panegyrics of Catherine the Great, while Henry named Caroline ma meilleure amie. Both wanted Catherine to recognize their personal implication or investment in the success of her voyage. They sent her on her way to Russia, believing that they had successfully bound her to their network. They expected the future daughter-in-law of the Empress to write to Frederick and Henry. The marriage created a veritable burst of activity in Catherine's correspondence with Frederick too. His recommendation letter for Caroline was the first letter he had written to Catherine the Great in a full year. He'd been out of touch for a full year. He then wrote again during Caroline's visit on the 3rd of August and again on the 5th of November, with congratulations on the wedding, even before he had had time to receive Catherine's official notification. Nonetheless, the rules of etiquette did not permit the king to bombard Catherine directly to a much greater extent. He had already made sure that Catherine noticed his eagerness by including a formulaic apology for the time she had to spend reading his congratulations. Je connais trop l'usage précieux que votre majesté impériale fait de son temps pour l'importuner mal à propos par mes lettres, mais l'occasion présente des noces de grand-duc est de celle où la plénitude de cœur rompt toutes les barrières qui s'opposent à son effervescence. Instead, he wrote to Caroline 6 times, no fewer than 6 times, while she was in St. Petersburg, filling his letters with flattery and compliments she was meant to deliver to Catherine, therefore winning favor with Catherine. Meanwhile, Catherine wrote to Frederick's brother Henry at about her usual frequency, a letter every month or so, but the marriage became its necessary focus for the entire year. Catherine, in her letters, is cordial, but also restrained in her response to Frederick. She answered most of his letters sent during the Landgravin's visit, except for that of the 3rd of August, but she initiated nothing in her own hand. She didn't start the correspondence. She waited. She wrote 2 letters on the 30th of September, officially informing Frederick of the marriage and bestowing the Order of St. Catherine on her son's new sister-in-law, Frederica of Prussia, but the letters are written by a secretary. They're not in her own hand. She also worded her oral response to the letters Caroline shared with her, knowing that her every move would be dutifully relayed back to the king. In other words, she told Caroline what to say in a letter. You know, I advise you, or you can quote me as follows. In her replies, Catherine affirmed that the ongoing transaction, meaning the marriage, was a confirmation of her present alliance with Frederick, and she uses the long-standing diplomatic language that treated alliances between states as friendship. Caroline quoted her words directly to the king, writing, Ce qui me flatte surtout et ce qui me fait plaisir, c'est de voir que le roi me conserve son amitié, fut sa réponse. The exchange grew repetitive very quickly. L'impératrice paraît flattée quand je lui rends compte de ce que votre majesté me dit à son sujet. Elle répond toujours qu'elle ne mérite point ses éloges, mais qu'elle est sensible et qu'elle sent tout le prix de l'amitié que votre majesté a pour elle. So totally formulaic, but Frederick eventually changed tack and let loose his verve for religious irreverence on the occasion of Natalia Alexeyevna's conversion. So when he heard that she'd converted to Orthodoxy, he was quite rude about it. Catherine was amused by this, but didn't respond right to him. Caroline reported, Les hoquets de la confession d'Augsbourg l'ont beaucoup amusé l'impératrice. Frederick could feel satisfied with his attempts, since his goals of flattering and amusing the empress had been met. Catherine confirmed her presence in his network, but did so with minimal effort. Frederick did not manage to elicit anything more concrete or politically satisfying than an imperial smile. The princely correspondent with whom Catherine did eagerly engage was Caroline herself, so the mother of the bride, who was Frederick's friend, and her strategy is to take over that friendship and make Caroline her friend, and to create an ally out of her. The two women genuinely appreciated one another's intelligence, literary interests, and ability in government. Deeply and rightfully concerned about the failing health of the Landgravine, who suffered from asthma and who fell ill after several days on the road home to Darmstadt, Catherine immediately put her network into action, collecting information about Caroline's condition at every step of the way. So on the way back, there are lots of letters monitoring her condition. Catherine's efforts in this regard show, in contrast to her responses to Frederick, how she could mobilize a network when she so desired. Even Frederick noted in his letter to Catherine of 23 February 1774, « J'avoue à votre Majesté impériale que je suis étonné avec quelle attention elle a daigné suivre et presque accompagner l'itinéraire du voyage de Madame la Landgrave. » Catherine wrote to Frederick, Henry, and to the Landgravine herself, begging for news and expressing her concern, and her letters indicate other indirect sources of information as well, including the letters that the new Grand Duchess received from her mother and other relatives, and even letters that the visiting man of letters, Grimm, received from Germany. So these are other letters that are coming in that report on the news of the marriage, what impact it had made, but also on the health of Catherine's, as it were, the mother of her daughter-in-law, who's on her way back. To prove the genuineness of her concern, Catherine informed Caroline all of the ways she was looking out for her. So these are letters in which Frederick is not involved. They're now an independent correspondence that Catherine maintains. Malgré vos deux lettres de Potsdam, l'une de 9, l'autre de 10 de décembre, malgré votre départ de ce lieu, et même malgré ce que le roi de Prusse me dit dans une de ses lettres sur l'état de votre santé, qui devra me rassurer, je vous avoue que j'ai eu le plus vive inquiétude. La lettre de Madame de Buchwald à Grimm, écrite après le passage de votre Altesse par Gotha, m'a cependant un peu calmé. So there we have evidence of a whole other correspondence between Madame de Buchwald and Grimm, to which somehow she has access. No doubt Grimm is supplying her, maybe even in an interview, with information saying this is what people are saying. In writing to Henry, Catherine implied that she was acquainted with the letters exchanged between mother and daughter, that she was also aware of what Caroline and Wilhelmine were writing to one another. Observing, je vois qu'elle prépare sa fille à cet événement, cette perte me sera bien douloureuse. Learning in March from Natalia Alexeyevna that the Landgravine's condition was rapidly deteriorating, Catherine made a last demonstration of concern, sending an estafette bearing letters from Paul, Natalia, and Catherine herself, and urging her to consult les plus habiles médecins. An estafette was a courier who travels by relay, was a very expensive means of transporting a message at the time, and it again shows how much Catherine valued the new connection she had made in the Landgravine. But also we were talking about les cabinets noirs, we were talking about other means of correspondence. It's a way of writing directly to the Landgravine that completely cuts out Frederick the Great, who no doubt had his own ways of finding out what was going on. But the show of independence is very important. And this was the last letter that Catherine wrote to the Landgravine. Now, in all this, Catherine the Great depended entirely on her own back channel, and there's a whole separate correspondence about the marriage with a figure named Schatz Ferdinand von der Asseberg, who's her primary informant and intermediary in the initial selection of the bride. So although Catherine is playing the game and giving Frederick the impression that they they both approve of the same woman. In fact, she is actually actively searching the European scene for the right sort of bride. And she knows that in corresponding with Aschatz Ferdinand van der Asperg, he will let people know that she is actively scrutinizing candidates and doing it totally independent of Frederick the Great. Frederick, of course, found out about this, and he wrote to the Landgravine that he would be able to influence Asperg because the latter was a Prussian subject, albeit a subject in Danish and then in Russian service. So he worked for Catherine at the time, but Frederick was convinced that it didn't matter. He would still be manipulated by him. That wasn't actually the case. Caroline kept Asperg informed of the contents of Frederick's letters to the Landgravine so that he could not have mistaken the wishes of his sovereign. But when Frederick ordered his primary minister, Count Karl Wilhelm Fink von Finkelstein, to write to Asperg and tell him to arrange for a princess of Hesse-Darmstadt to be chosen, Asperg refused. Mon devoir est de m'en tenir à ces bornes étroites qu'on m'a posées, et mon bonheur celui de n'avoir aucune décision. So he's willing to pass information along, but not betray Catherine by working against her. So Catherine corresponded both directly and indirectly with Asperg. She wrote in her own hand to Asperg as a sign of the matter's importance to her, and her tone sought to elicit his absolute trust and honesty, asking him to assess the contradictory reports. So she's written to Frederick. You've heard the letter, a bit of the letter, and she says she's great. Wilhelmine is great. She's obviously the best. In fact, she was writing to her marriage scout at the same time, saying, soyez assurés que je connais le prix des soins que vous donnez à une affaire qui me tient d'aussi près. And regarding Wilhelmine's character, que sur ce point, vous vous en croyez plus vous-même et vos yeux que tous les pros qui pourraient vous revenir sur son compte. At other points, she strategically allowed her prime minister, Nikitin Panin, who was also a friend of Asperg's, to correspond with him on her behalf. So another correspondence opens up, and Nikita Panin is the mentor to Paul I. So this is also terribly important because Catherine is in a very conflictual and tense relationship with Nikita because she thinks that he's conspiring against her. So she wants to involve him in the choice of bride as well, to keep him on side. Although Catherine had previously asked Asperg to issue a proposal to another princess, she soon retracted the offer. And when it came to invite Caroline of Hesse-Darmstadt and her daughters to Russia, Catherine more cautiously had Panin transmit the order to Asperg, thus avoiding any commitment on her part. She had him make the approach. Clearly following Catherine's dictates, Panin told Asperg to invite the princesses, sans engager la parole de Sa Majesté pour aucune des trois. Vous pourrez toujours lui faire envisager qu'il faudrait une fatalité inouïe, pour aucune d'entre elles n'importe le suffrage de l'auguste mère conjointement avec celui de son fils, qui s'aime si tendrement. Well, they didn't like one another, Paul and Catherine, and the letter you heard to Frederick and the other testimony that I cited earlier suggests that Catherine had made up her mind before Wilhelmine arrived. In fact, that wasn't the case. As she says to Asperg, on va voir. Even though Caroline and Catherine both knew that Wilhelmine's age made her obviously the favored candidate, Catherine wanted to retain the ultimate right to choose for herself. And her momentary withdrawal from the network by having Panin write instead signaled that intention. I know this is very detailed and complex, but I think it's worth pursuing with the story just to the end because I think it in a way, that's the point of the illustration. You don't have to remember all of the names and all of the cross-currents to see what's going on here. Once the invitation had been issued and accepted, Catherine continued to use her intermediaries to make her presence felt through the Landgravine's journey. So as we know, she stopped in Berlin, saw Frederick, saw Henry, was instructed on how to behave at court, but at the same time, she was also being approached by Catherine's intermediaries while she was in Berlin. Catherine had Major General Rehbinder and Baron Alexander Cherkasov accompany Caroline and her daughters on their journey to Russia from that point. Rehbinder traveled with Catherine's ships to Lübeck in northern Germany, where he collected the princesses, Cherkassov met them on Catherine's behalf upon their arrival in Tallinn. Raybinder and Cherkassov escorted them to St. Petersburg. Catherine drafted instructions for both men in her own hand. She wrote to Raybinder in German, she wrote to Cherkassov in French, carefully stage managing the entire spectacle. So carefully stage managing how they entered St. Petersburg. Raybinder was to become Catherine's eyes and ears as she made her selection. He was instructed to observe up close which of the daughters was Caroline's favorite, not likely to please Paul, but as I said, she's hoping to make an ally out of Caroline, who is Frederick's friend. So she wants to know which of the daughters is Caroline's favorite, whether they behave respectably, and whether they face the perilous sea voyage cheerfully and bravely, i.e. whether they'd be able to stick it out in Russia. When Raybinder arrived in Lübeck, he was to send a courier with Catherine's letter to Berlin. So it was Catherine in person who announced the arrival of the ships in Germany. Even though she wasn't there, she wants to give the appearance that she's waiting for them in Berlin. So she has a letter written beforehand that she gives to her emissary, who's closer to Germany, and he sends it to make the announcement that the Empress greeted your daughters in, but in fact she wasn't there at all, and she hadn't seen them. And her emissary is basically doing a beauty contest or a beauty parade, evaluating the family relations. Catherine, too, was the first to greet the ladies in Tallinn, but again, by means of a letter sent to Cherkassov, even though she wasn't there herself. So the letter doesn't go to the daughters in Tallinn. A letter is sent from Tallinn to Berlin saying, I was delighted to meet your daughters today. What matters is not the historic lie, which eventually would be revealed. What matters is what people in Berlin are thinking in the week and the 2 weeks that form the window of opportunity during which it takes a letter for further discussion. The use of intermediaries could thus paradoxically create the impression of Catherine's ubiquitous presence in the network surrounding Caroline, thus beginning to detach Caroline from her exclusive ties to Frederick. Yet, as in the case of Catherine's interactions with Augsburg through Panin, the intermediaries were asked to say things that Catherine could not personally express in her letters of compliment. Both men were given secret instructions to intimate to the princesses that they should listen to no one's advice except Catherine's own. She wrote to Cherkassov, Monsieur le Baron aura la bonté de chercher l'occasion d'insinuer à Madame la Landgrave d'avoir pour moi la plus grande confiance, de se régler d'après mes avis. D'ailleurs, je souhaite qu'elle ait de l'égalité dans la conduite vis-à-vis de tout le monde. Beaucoup d'attention et de politesse, mais point de préférence, et surtout aucune pour les avis et conseils de la politique. So that's Catherine writing to her ambassador, as it were, her representative, who's meeting the daughters, and this is what she's supposed to tell them. The two intermediaries were thus an essential link in the new bond she was forming with Caroline, and an essential instrument by which she tried to break the ties between Caroline, Prussia, and any pro-Prussian intriguers at the Russian court. That's what les avis et conseils de la politique means. Tell them not to meddle with people who are pro-Prussian at court. So these secret administrative letters were key to Catherine's assertion of power over her network. Now, there are more examples. I could continue, actually, on what happens next. It's been quite a long lecture already. And so I think that I'm not going to continue. I've got a few more pages in the same detail. But I think what's interesting to know here is that, as I said, Grimm arrived at the same time. And Grimm would be Catherine's greatest correspondent. There are over 500 letters to Grimm. And he arrives in 1773. And as it happens, he'd been trying to attract Catherine's attention for some time. As we said last week, Voltaire sort of ignored Catherine for a while. Grimm had been trying very hard to get her attention. He'd been sending her the Correspondence littéraire since 1764. When Henry of Prussia visited Russia, he wrote a letter to the prince, and in it he explained that je lui demande de ne pas laisser ignorer à l'impératrice les bontés dont il m'honore, afin qu'elle me juge moins indigne de celle qu'elle a pour moi. So he wants to be honored. He says, I'm friendly with the Landgravine. Catherine the Great, you know, it would be lovely if she was nice to me and treated me in the same way. When he finally had the opportunity to meet Catherine, she immediately realized the usefulness of the contact and was very warm to him. Diderot was visiting at the same time. Of course, she enjoyed Diderot's correspondence enormously, but she knew that Grimm could also be very, very useful for the cultural networking. And so it's around the same time that Catherine the Great, as she's manipulating Frederick and the marriage network around Paul, she initiates her greatest correspondence with Grimm, who leaves Russia in April of 1774, promising to write to her. And she instructs him more or less to tell Frederick the Great that Grimm has now become her friend. And he takes pains to show that he's part of the network, connecting Catherine with the Russian royal family. And he writes in a letter to the minister, Nesselrode, Le roi Frédéric m'a honoré de 2 lettres depuis que je suis ici. J'espérais au moins en recevoir une de celui dont la protection immédiate a eu pour moi tant de suite heureuse et attendue. That's Henry. J'espérais pouvoir m'en vanter à l'impératrice, qu'enfin nous communiquons nos petits secrets. Elle me dit le bien quand elle a reçu une lettre de son ami de Rendsburg. Pourquoi ne le lui rendrai-je pas? So Grimm is bragging and boasting now of being in her network, and Catherine begins to write to him from April of 1774 regularly in her own hand, not only because he's her most important cultural agent in Europe, but and because she enjoys writing the letters, but because he can see that it's a useful counter or useful vis-a-vis what Frederick is doing in Europe and his own correspondence networks. So I think the case study is trying to show that understanding Catherine's art of epistolary networking asks us to look beyond the immediate figures in her circle. I showed you a list. You've given some names. This lecture had many names that were not necessarily very familiar to you, and that she uses culture. Grimm is essentially a cultural correspondent, but she will use him for political matters. She uses familial ties and marital ties. After all, a dynastic marriage is intrinsically a political event. She uses these direct and indirect communications very, very skillfully. The contents of the letters, the ways in which they were phrased or presented to their addressees, the ways in which they circulated beyond their initial address matters a great deal. These features are often very hard to trace using printed sources, rather, but with the help of some digital sources and with the help of modeling the kind we've been doing, they, I think, help us get to the essence of the art that Catherine exercised with so much flair. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer, or try to answer questions.
Pour cette très très belle conférence qui a complété la première que nous avions eu le privilège d'entendre. Alors, tu as montré à quel point il y a là un instrument de connaissance absolument formidable de différents points de vue pour les historiens. Hein. Tu nous permets d'éclairer ce moment. En même temps, un instrument de connaissance qu'il faut apprendre à lire avec beaucoup de prudence. Tu nous as parlé de ces lettres où Catherine II fait preuve d'ubiquité. Elle dit être à certains endroits, elle n'est pas en réalité. Donc il faut apprendre à se méfier de pièges que tend ce corpus. Et alors, une chose qui m'a frappée au début, c'est cette carte que tu nous as fait voir, avec les réseaux ces réseaux européens de Catherine II, cette carte donc qu'il est possible enfin de construire. Et c'est vrai que ça donne une toute autre image des Lumières et du rôle de la Russie, de Saint-Pétersbourg. Tu as montré que d'un seul coup, ce petit point devient un énorme point sur la carte, connecté vers plein d'endroits. Et là, on se rend compte à quel point les correspondances, l'étude de ces correspondances, qui est en plein développement pour le siècle des Lumières notamment, mais pas seulement, c'est un instrument remarquable parce que longtemps, je crois que l'histoire intellectuelle des Lumières, elle a été faite à partir des sources imprimées. Et on a une toute autre carte des réseaux, de la circulation de l'écrit, si on considère l'imprimé. Et si tout à coup, on se met à considérer les réseaux de circulation des écrits manuscrits, alors là surgit tout un autre ensemble de connaissances qui sont disponibles et qui sont absolument fabuleuses. Donc merci. Alors, je ne sais pas si tu veux répondre, ou si je passe tout de suite le...
No, I think it's an excellent observation. And I think we can talk a bit more about it, but yes.
I did wonder about whether the example of Catherine with the back channels and the way she uses correspondence, is there something special about the way monarchs use correspondence? I mean, it's a very... Maria Theresa, for example, I was thinking of reading the books about what Maria Theresa does when her daughter Marie Antoinette arrives in Paris, and she's very anxious. Marie Antoinette is very young. She doesn't know quite how to cope with this very young bridegroom. And people talk about the correspondence between Maria Theresa and her daughter, and it's very touching in some ways, telling her daughter what to do. It's very attentive. But at the same time, there's another correspondence between Maria Theresa and the Austrian ambassador in Paris, finding out what's really happening. Has the king slept with his bride? What are they saying at court? What's the gossip? And you have to read the two things in parallel to know what's really going on. So I'm wondering whether there's a sort of, I mean, I don't know, it's not so much a question as a reflection on whether there's something particular about the networks of monarchs. That are they obliged to have these sort of back channels and...
Well, I'm not a historian. I'm a literature scholar in the first instance, and I've sort of, my interests have grown, and so I'm not a historian of monarchy, and there are others who can give much more authoritative, better answers. But I think if you just look at the Russian court from the 70s, I think one way to answer the question, and it's, I feel most comfortable answering the question based on what I know, which is the history of the Russian court from the 1750s. You find, so the history of the Russian imperial family and the Russian court essentially is not a very stable one. There isn't primogeniture. Succession is very often decided really by assassination, as well as genealogy. And there are substantial factions. However, I think there's a big change between the reign of Elizabeth I and the reign of Catherine the Great in the function and structure of the court. So in the reign of Elizabeth I is the daughter of Peter the Great. She's known for having 14,000 dresses. She didn't write 14,000 letters or sign 14,000 documents. She had 14,000 dresses. And she rebuilt St. Petersburg, but she's Catherine's mother-in-law. She relies heavily on a couple of favorites, but the court is very small, very, very small, and her foreign policy is fairly inert, and her cultural policy is also fairly static. So the period between 1741 and 1762 is really quite a static one. It's a real interruption after Peter the Great. And I think she was able to rule really just by keeping an eye on what was happening right in front of her in St. Petersburg, more or less. I think one of the effects of Catherine's activity, well, first of all, one of the effects of Catherine's history in Russia is that from the time she arrives in Russia, she is claimed by different factions. She's watched, she's observed the British 2 or 3 British ambassadors fill their correspondence with observations of how the young princess is behaving, you know, what her potential is, what's likely to happen. And even before she, after she marries and before she becomes the empress, she's implicated in a conspiracy. She writes treasonous letters and gets into an awful lot of trouble. And Elizabeth I finds out. And the letters are very, very interesting. Catherine writes 2 letters to the empress in which she begs forgiveness. And forgiveness is actually extended. She survives. But I think what's interesting there is that the court becomes much more complicated, much larger, much more characterized by faction, because Catherine relies on a set of people who put her on the throne. They're rich landowners, they're military men. There are 5 Orlov brothers, all of whom back her because they hate her husband. So imagine that. You've got just one family with 5 interested parties, all of whom have to be kept on side, all of whom have to be kept allies once she's on the throne. So there are many, many, many different interests at court and quite a number of factions. They are organized depending, you know, foreign policy may be one dominant that defines a relationship, cultural attitudes may be another, self-interest another. And I think, so Catherine has to be a very, very shrewd and astute manager of information to survive, and even to stay ahead. So I think, in a way, the answer to your question is, I don't know about monarchs in general, but Catherine herself understands very early on that she has to control the story. And she has to move certain information, and she has to stop certain information, and she has to generate certain information. And that it matters a great deal. And perception really does matter a great deal. So using correspondence to backchannel is absolutely essential in the way she... So, I mean, you take the instance of this marriage. You could just look at it and say, I mean, most histories say in 1773, 74, Paul I married Wilhelmina of Hesse-Darmstadt. She died, she became Natalia Alexeyevna, she died 2 years later. They don't mention her mother, they don't mention Frederick the Great, or they simply view it as a family alliance. But I think what's important here is that Catherine sees it. She sees the mother, Caroline, as a potential ally, right, against, or, you know, a go-between with Frederick, but also a potential ally. And that relationship is implicated in her own court politics, where the question of whether to be closer to Prussia or England matters a great deal, and also impinges on the aspirations of a party that may be hoping to relegate Catherine and put Paul I on the throne. She doesn't know what role Frederick will play in trying to destabilize her position, but she doesn't trust him for a minute. And I think this is partly why this matters so much.
Oui, merci pour cette présentation qui est très frappante, notamment par l'étendue du travail qui reste peut-être à faire. Quand on voit le nombre de lettres...
Nous étions 2.
Oui, la faiblesse peut-être de l'équipe, même si je sais chacun de très bonne volonté. J'aurais voulu savoir à peu près où vous en êtes de ce travail sur le dépouillement et l'inventaire, le catalogue de la correspondance de Catherine, et aussi quel est plus précisément l'état des sources sources. Alors il y a quelques autographes de la main de Catherine, d'autres ont été publiés sur des journaux. Donc est-ce qu'on a des manuscrits pour ces lettres-là? Est-ce que l'on sait un peu s'il y a eu des manipulations? Quel est le degré de fiabilité en fait de ce qui nous reste de la correspondance?
So I'm answering in English because it's easier, but another great questions. So the answer to the first question is really about the state of CatCor. If we could go online, I could show you a bit more how it works and the map, but it doesn't really matter that much. So we haven't even had a soft launch yet, but I think we will launch it soon. And there is a firewall at the moment, and we're still concerned with making corrections to the text that's on it. But we hope to make it available. And in fact, if all of you could receive it, and if you want to be users, which would be really, really lovely. And so we need to think through. But the answer to the question is that on the metadata, we've done about 30%, and we've run out of money, because neither I nor Kelsey have the time to do essentially the bibliographic work required. So we've employed, for the metadata, we had one graduate student at Oxford named Lucy Dunlop, who's actually a Soviet specialist, but reads Russian, but also knows French, and is very, very accurate. And so we guided her and supervised her. So she compiled the metadata, which we then formatted using a template that Miranda Lewis from MLO gave us, or used with us. So I think... So we're hoping to, and then the further answer is that CatCor as a whole, at the moment, is just sort of frozen until we make new funding applications. Partly this was a question of Kelsey's. Kelsey finished her doctoral work under my supervision. She had a research fellowship. We worked together on the project. We had funding from the British Academy and the Leverhulme for a certain amount, and we employed 3 people to do the TEI XML tagging. We sent one of them to the Oxford Digital Summer School, which Kelsey herself attended. She did a certain amount of tagging at the beginning and supervised it. I did no tagging. I can read the code, but I never did any tagging. My time is too expensive. I wouldn't say it's too valuable, but it's too expensive. And we're at a point where we need to seek significant resources to finish the project. And I think what we want to do next is try to raise a small amount of money to finish the metadata, because the metadata is in itself a useful datum or body of knowledge. And once we've done that, think about a substantial bid. And yes, that is in the works. We are planning to do a funding bid. Now, interestingly, and Glenn and Nicholas and Natalie will understand these things. I think if you did a database 20 years ago, the database itself looked really cool and was great to have. And one could argue that the database was the product of a funding, of an investment. That, there is no correspondence of Catherine the Great. To do it in book form would be enormously expensive. You'd need a huge team of Russian researchers based in Russia, and it's not likely to happen now. So something like this as actually an addition would be a great thing to have. But the truth is that, as I understand it, but people in the audience may have a more refined view, but at the moment, the way to justify the creation and completion of a database like this is to link it to a set of research questions and larger projects that require the tool. Without which, so I think it is demonstrable that this is a body of knowledge that will change the way we see the period. Exactly how, I can't say. Whether it be major, minor, small adjustments, big adjustments, a big revisionist account, that depends. But one has to ask these sorts of questions and link projects that depend on the database to justify the funding of the database. At least that's the model in the UK. So that's what we're thinking about at the moment. And I think we actually have some good ideas. But I have to say, if there's anyone here who is thinking of a project of a kind that somehow would make use of a database like this, tangentially, right? You know, just a small connection, or let's have a conversation about it at some point. So that's the first, I think that answers the first question. On the question of sources and the state of editions, so we have found in comparing, so this is not an editio princeps. This is not a scholarly edition of, and I had this question, I gave a talk at Yale a couple of years ago, and there's a historian at Yale who's much respected, but he's a very fundamentalist on this issue, and feels that if you're going to do anything at all, you've got to go back to all the manuscripts. But of course, if we did that, we wouldn't be able to produce anything, because it would take forever to go and sit in the Russian archives and redo and do the work that way. What we have found on the basis of random checks where manuscripts are available is that the 19th century editions are very faithful. They are correct. However, they're very correct semantically. Where they differ is in the transcriptions of punctuation and formatting. And I do have to say that modern editors also make choices. So Gunther von Proschwitz, in his edition of the letters to Gustav III, makes some, I mean, he must have looked at the manuscripts, but some of the formatting of the printed version looks unusual. Same with other editors of the letters to Voltaire, and Voltaire's letters to Catherine. Some of the punctuation looks very idiosyncratic. So that's where there's some guesswork. There are some letters that are clearly Bowdlerized, that have been edited. And I think I said last week, letters on sensitive personal issues, like the true parentage of Paul I, whether he is actually the son of Peter III. The 19th century Russian editors just cut all that out of those letters. So you have to go to the manuscript letters to see what Catherine wrote about whether Peter III was the father of, and she had another child, Alexei Bobrinsky. So that's also a sensitive point. But for the most part, we found that 90–95% of the letters are word for word correct, which encouraged us to think that this is a project that, once we eliminate our own mistakes, is a reliable resource. It's no worse than the editions people have been using for 200 years. Sometimes it is those editions. It's just you can use them more easily and also search them and do things with them that you couldn't before. And then there is the question of manuscripts. And yes, there are manuscripts. There are loads and loads of manuscripts. And it is possible to go and there are letters that are unpublished, and it is possible, actually. In fact, Kelsey wrote to me last week, so she's in California. She wrote to me last week and said, a collector in Chicago wants to know what I think of a letter apparently signed by Catherine the Great. I'd like to know what you think of this letter first, whether it's authentic and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think this happens all the time, actually, for other correspondences, and it's still happening with Catherine. So, was that all the questions? Yeah, okay. But I think, so really it's the questions of funding, sources. Now, I know that our dear friend, the director of ITEM, Paolo Diorio, who's not here, he's a great believer in digital editions being done to exactly the same standard as print editions. And I agree entirely, except that, I would qualify this and say that this is not an editio princeps of the Correspondence of Catherine the Great, for which each letter probably has only one manuscript, and you're not going to do, an edition would not have that many variants. You would make corrections, but also I'm not sure if you look at risk and reward and cost and reward and feasibility and reward, it's going to matter. It'll be much more helpful to have this, even in an imperfect state, I think, than to have the idea. So, you know, the Œuvre complète de Voltaire is obviously a great monument to the best kind of textual scholarship. I'm not sure it's necessary for Catherine.
En fait, le problème, c'est la relation avec les lieux d'archives. Dans
Ça,
le cas de Nietzsche,
c'est
c'est possible parce qu'il y a eu dès le départ des accords avec les archives de Weimar qui permettaient justement une grande exactitude et puis la reproduction des manuscrits. Dans le cas de Catherine II, je suppose qu'une grande partie de ces archives sont en Russie, avec des conditions d'accessibilité qui sont certainement très très difficiles. Alors il se peut que vous travaillez à un premier état de ce travail qui va par la suite, une fois que ce sera en ligne, permettre un retour au manuscrit dans une seconde phase.
Tout à fait.
Par d'autres équipes qui peuvent être sur place, etc.
Voilà,
donc,
tout à fait. Parce que la base de données sera très... On peut rajouter les nouveautés, les nouvelles choses, comme les manuscrits, assez facilement. Et oui, on peut créer même un site dans le site pour les facsimiles. Tout à fait. Mais ce qui concerne les questions de travail, ça, ce sont les choses de... Souvent la politique interne des groupes de recherche en Russie. Nous nous sommes approchés des gens qui étaient très intéressés, mais malheureusement, le chef de l'équipe, c'était quelqu'un de bien, quelqu'un très, je dirais, un homme des Lumières, qui était désigné le ministre des études, des universités en Russie, et après 2 mois, il était chassé. Et sa position était vraiment basculée dans l'Institut, et maintenant, il n'y a plus de fonds pour les choses comme ça. Autrement, il y a des gens qui ont déjà fait un grand boulot, comme le chercheur qui a publié l'édition de Correspondance avec Grimm. C'est vraiment quelqu'un qui connaît très bien les sources, il connaît très bien les matériaux, mais il a déjà annoncé qu'il n'est pas prêt à partager avec n'importe où. Et ça, c'est une personne, mais malheureusement, comme vous savez, il y a la politique des archives aussi. Ici, il y a quelqu'un qui travaille dans une archive qui a déjà annoncé qu'il ne veut pas faire une collaboration avec les autres, qui veut travailler dans cette archive. En fait, l'archive est bloquée. Et je pense que quand même la vie est courte, il y a autre chose à faire, les résultats, les sources sont déjà publiées. Et je pense que, d'une part, c'est une question de présentation. Comment présenter CatCor pour... Nous voudrions que ce soit très utile et autoritatif, mais à la fois, il faut quand même annoncer que ce n'est pas une édition critique des lettres, mais quand même, je pense qu'on n'est pas obligé de se méfier de cette source, parce que quand même, ça reproduit les sources imprimées qui sont déjà assimilées et utilisées pendant les décennies déjà. Et si les historiens, les experts de la littérature ne se plaignent pas des sources imprimées qui ne sont pas disponibles, je pense que nous avons le droit d'essayer de les convaincre que c'est quand même un site tout à fait correct et utile, oui.
Thank you so much. So I have 2 questions. One is, I guess, more you-oriented, and then one is a little bit more from a selfish point of view. So with respect to the the project. I was interested in your claim in the beginning about sort of re-looking at the way that we think of center and periphery in the Enlightenment, because I was thinking of the Stanford Digital Humanities Project on Voltaire's Correspondences, where one of the main conclusions that they came to was that it was actually a much more national correspondence than we would think. 70% of letters were actually sent within France. We have this idea of a cosmopolitan Voltaire. Did I say Rousseau? Sorry, Voltaire.
No, you said Voltaire.
Okay, good. I thought I mixed them up. Yeah, Voltaire.
Not sure which of the two would be flattered by the confusion.
That's actually very erroneous. But it seems like the opposite is the case for Catherine the Great, that actually once you look into the letters, you see a more cosmopolitan network than you were expecting. So my question is, is this a challenge to a general conception of the Enlightenment as being cosmopolitan or national, or are these just sort of two coexisting theses that these both writers maybe functioned a little bit different than we expected?
Mm-hmm. So it's a brilliant question. It's a very good question, and it's a question that I'm hoping to tackle in a book I'm writing. So I'll be here at a research institute next year in Paris, and I've got a project to write a book on the Russian Enlightenment. And these are issues that are rooted in the description, the plan. And I think I think we talked a little bit about this week. I mean, I think that discussions of the Enlightenment, and there are other people here who are extremely authoritative and very knowledgeable, and I hope they'll chip in. But it seems to me that models are always a bit in flux. So, excuse me. So at the moment, the kind of center-periphery paradigm seems to be fashionable, partly, I think, because I think there are satellite projects all over the globe. Maybe one of the kind of Enlightenment seems to be epiphenomenal, partly because I think there are university projects all over Europe, South America, Eastern Europe, where people are interested in the Enlightenment as a local phenomenon. And once upon a time, the model of kind of national versus single or monolithic, that was debated. And I think center and periphery is seen as a more supple, fluid, less colonial sort of model for and also maybe more consonant with the Republic of Letters. It's true, you could say that periphery implies a hierarchy, without question. I think that periphery gives us the opportunity to redescribe, according to local conditions, the definition of how the Enlightenment worked, what it was exactly, of really trying to define how an Enlightenment, was conceived. Who did it? How many? Does it depend on, what are the essential criteria in the description of how it functioned? Is it public sphere? Is it intellectual history? Is it institutional history? Is it prizes? Is it literature? Is it primary writing? Is it translation? Is it all of them? How many? So I think now on the subject of cosmopolitan, Catherine didn't travel. She's not a very cosmopolitan person. She never leaves. In fact, it's only in the 1780s that she feels comfortable going down the Volga with Joseph II and taking a tour of her empire. From 1762 to 1780, I think, she doesn't leave St. Petersburg except to go to Moscow or other places in metropolitan Russia, because she's watching her back. She's not absolutely sure, she's a little concerned. So she, in a way, she's a virtual tourist. She's a virtual tourist, and she visits through correspondences. In the first letter she writes to Geoffrin, so I think it's, if I can remember correctly, this came up at Stanford. Nicholas and I went to Stanford when Dan Edelstein had an event there to talk about this and other projects. And I think Madame de Geoffrin, her first letter to Catherine the Great, on the back of the envelope, there's a little note signed by a Russian chambermaid named Anastasia, who sends her greetings to the Empress. She'd been in the employ, I think, of the Hermitage, and ended up working for Madame de Geoffrin in Paris, and says, sort of, hello, here I am. So Madame de Geoffrin writes to Catherine, and Catherine writes back in very interesting terms. She says, I know you are in Paris. I know you are at the center of the Enlightenment, and I am only a mere empress. But let's, and I think I discussed this last week a bit, but let's forget all about that. Let's leave at the door all of our formalities, and let's talk to one another as friends and as equals. But of course, she knows that Geoffrin can't approach her as an equal. But I think it's her, as it were, demonstration of a certain type of what we might call Enlightenment sensibility. Maybe a bit what you would find, like, not what you would find in a Masonic lodge, but perhaps not entirely dissimilar, where there's no rank. She says there's no rank in our letters. And that's not how she treats everyone. So I think, in a way, yes, it does invert the cosmopolitan model because she doesn't travel. On the other hand, the cosmopolitan model is not totally alien to Russia. If you look at Karamzin's Letters of a Russian Traveler, which exists, it's a huge book, exists in an English translation, done by me, I have to say. But Karamzin is a fantastic traveler. And in the tradition of great European travelers, he's also an interesting liar about whom he meets and what he does and what he sees. So Russians do go abroad, but Catherine uses the letters, I think, to project enlightenment of a certain kind abroad. For instance, for her, I think she would say that a defining feature of the Enlightenment is religious toleration. And she would say that Russia is far more tolerant than France. And she would say Russia is more tolerant of religion than France and, above all, the Ottoman Empire, which is why she fights the Turks. Of course, she fights the Turks because she wants to conquer Crimea. But she uses Voltaire as a medium for getting out this message that it's a war of tolerance. She's fighting a war of tolerance. So that would be one example where Catherine is... says Russia is actually a more advanced civilization. And there are Europeans who believe it or accept it, and they suggest it. Anyway, so does that answer or respond?
Yes, great, thank you. And then I guess we probably need to wrap up. But,
No.
I work on 19th century literature, so I was just wondering very simply if you know of any resources that are comparable and available, because it seems like most of the work at Oxford and at Stanford has really focused on an earlier time period, and I don't really know many good digital databases for, I mean, I work on French, English, and German literatures.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, there are lots of databases, loads, and almost every author under the sun has a digital resource.
Right.
The question is whether they're actually really, digital humanities tools or...
developed to, this extent.
Well, this is, I mean, I think, I don't know how you found this, but I think this is a pretty good database, and it would be great to complete it. There's a project in Toronto, for instance, that works on Russian émigré literature in Paris in the 20th century. It's a fantastic topic. As you know, after the revolution, loads of émigrés ended up here. So they spent a fortune of money. They had a huge grant. It's wonderful. It looks fantastic, except when you go to use it, what you find is that it's really the print sources just scanned. There is no search engine. So I wrote to the organizer or the principal investigator. I wrote very politely and said, I'm confused, or why? And he said, you're absolutely right. This is not what, this is not, we couldn't afford to do the TEI XML sort of thing. So we've ended up doing this, which is static, and you can't really search it very well. But if you need to read certain items, at least they're here. So that's a kind of intermediary. But I think I'm not the right person, I'm not the right person to answer your question with reference to the universe of databases. But I do know that Stanford is obviously very cutting edge. Artful is very cutting edge for the Encyclopédie, but it is 18th century. you know, fantastic. I've written an article about Radishev that I probably couldn't have done without using some of the peripheral material on Artful about the Histoire des deux Indes of Raynal. So, but I don't know about, but I'm sure that there must be 19th century. But I mean, you've obviously looked. I mean, there's Echo in the 18th century's Echo in Oxford. There's EMLO, Early Modern Letters Online, which is an umbrella for lots of things.
I suspect that there's something about the early modern period. I don't know what perhaps Natalie just that there's something about the early modern period that lends itself to this sort of networking. That there's something about the way that the Enlightenment works. I'm talking in big generalizations, but there's something about the Enlightenment where they're doing something quite self-conscious. I mean, the idea of lumière is a self-conscious thing. And this exchange of letters, and it could also be newspapers, or it could be journals, between St. Petersburg and Berlin and Paris and London, they call it the Republic of Letters. Whereas I don't think the 19th century, I mean, it's different, isn't it? There's a different sort of press world, a different type of press culture. And of course, you could produce fantastic things by networking diplomatic documents. I don't think it's quite constructed in such a network.
I mean, it partly comes back to Natalie's first point about manuscripts and circulation, a huge amount of material. I mean, by the 19th century, we're in a mechanized information galaxy where newspapers and printing of books happens in a very, it's huge, it's just enormous.
But the other thing that connected with that was your question began by being interesting about centre and periphery. But in the end, I mean, what you're really saying is that from one perspective, Petersburg isn't a periphery. I mean, it's just perhaps we should be saying it's multi-centred rather than centre-periphery. I saw the other day something really quite fascinating. Someone has studied economic discussion in South America in the Enlightenment. This does exist. There is discussion about economic theory. Now, normally, if you have a sort of European-centred view of economic theory, we say the economic theory comes from Paris, physiocrats, or it comes from Edinburgh, the Scottish Enlightenment and so on. But in fact, for all sorts of obvious, when you think about it, cultural reasons of the Bourbons and so on, in South America, they read books from Naples. And so there was a Neapolitan school of economics, Filangieri, and there are others around. And those were the books that were read in South America. So in fact, South American Enlightenment economics apparently all comes from Naples. So how do you do centre? Where's the centre? Where's the periphery there? If you're in South America, Naples is the centre. I mean, which is not true if you're in London or Edinburgh or Paris. So it's it's a kaleidoscope actually, where the notion of periphery is a bit fudged.
Well, I was standing in a quad of an Oxford college a few years ago, and a colleague, was holding a book by John Robertson, who's an Oxford and now Cambridge intellectual historian, and it's called The Case for Enlightenment, and Scotland and Naples, I think, right? And a very grand French professor, who will remain nameless, but a very imposing academic and very distinguished, was at the same event, and she walked by and she saw this person holding this book, and she said, there was a time when people said France was the center of the Enlightenment. Les Lumières, c'était pour Lazare. I said, well, so actually I ran away. But I think that, it's a very, very interesting question. And, in a way, one is thinking about the kind of point of origin and the kind of the place that generates ideas, and then the place that sort of adapts and changes and echoes and reverberations. I don't think anyone would say that St. Petersburg or Russia in the 18th century is the progenitor of, in any category of anything startlingly new. On the other hand, the local versions and adaptations, economic theory, political economy, attitudes to slavery, use of literature, elimination of philosophy. I mean, you might say, how can you have an enlightenment in a country that adamantly refuses to just does not have philosophers and is hostile to philosophy and thinks that the right place for abstract discussion is in literature, but not in philosophy. And make sure that university curricula do not have philosophy on them. You know, you might think it's impossible to have enlightenment, but then maybe one is talking about pragmatic enlightenment or different enlightenment. So I think periphery is an enabler and gives other traditions a chance to assert their, as it were, I don't know, profile, personality, particular micro-histories, which are really interesting and very important. I mean, I don't know, Enlightenment history in Lyon very different from, is the history of Enlightenment in Lyon very, very different from the history of Enlightenment in Paris? It must be. But it depends what it means and how you describe it and who the enlighteners are. And there will be common features, but and maybe there are differences in scale rather than quality. But or Montpellier. I mean, Montpellier, maybe to take a better example, because of medicine in Montpellier, in science. It's very particular. Am I right in thinking that a lot of vitalists are somehow linked to, you know, people whose view of the Enlightenment is steeped in physiology and physiological theory come from Montpellier because there are certain schools there? It's possible.